an entity, and I do not represent the views of the ministry in any way. I'd also like to begin by thanking Pascal and Office for organizing this. Even though I couldn't be there, they've let me present my paper over here in whatever format that I can. So I just like to begin by talking about India's role in NAM and NPT, and the context would be that of the neutral, which is the theme of the conference. So when you look at India and the NPT first, India was now common parlance that India was an active participant in the discussions of for banning nuclear weapons and had proposed an end to nuclear testing in 54 months before the discussions for the NPT began. When the 10-nation disarmament committee began, India wanted to participate actively, and this is why in the 18-nation disarmament committee there was a very strong Indian participation, apart from other non-aligned countries like New Zealand and Mexico. And in all the talks that lasted, there is now ample evidence to prove how staunch a supporter India was of banning nuclear testing and banning nuclear weapons. But when the talks broke down, because of the slow disarmament and the non-aligned countries in the PG push for tangible steps to halt nuclear arms race and to limit, reduce, and eliminate stocks of nuclear weapons. Sorry. A sign of India's commitment to the NPT principles is that even though it did not agree to the terms of the treaty, New Delhi has consistently supported and initiated proposals towards nuclear non-proliferation. And additionally, India signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963 while China was preparing to test its weapons.
Kanica, excuse me, can you full screen your presentation?
My presentation is full screen.
It is full screen?
Yeah. It's not full screen on the...
No.
Is it full screen now?
No, can you hit again the full screen button? Can you hit it again?
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
No, we're seeing the other one.
I think it's okay.
Okay, sorry, continue like this. Sorry, continue.
Are you sure?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay, continue, sorry.
Is it full screen now?
We are seeing it, yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so when we talk about the 18-nation disarmament committee, one finds that participants use a forum to perform a burgeoning non-nuclear identity. The politics of this distinction is also generated the concept of what was nuclear apartheid, very commonly, which was most importantly put forward by Mr. Jaswant Singh, the External Affairs Minister. Now, when you look at India and NAM, we know that the then Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was a very strong supporter of the movement and took part very actively in the Bamboo Conference, which initiated the non-aligned movement and saw participation it was similar to the lines of the pre-NPT discussions and debates. And the focus, as always, from the Indian perspective, was on was supposed to be a democratic process which was based on mutual respect. When we look at India and NAM, India's role in the formation and sustenance of the NAM has been immense, and it was not only one of the founding members, but also the driving force behind the principles that NAM came to stand for. And it was, in fact, coined by India's ambassador to the India's then ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. D.K. When we understand strategic sovereignty and strategic autonomy and sovereignty, the concept of declassified documents from the US State Department points towards the possibility of India tacitly being offered a nuclear umbrella. But that offer was not entertained because of this need for strategic autonomy that we constantly see that is a theme that is running through India's foreign policy debate. Although the Soviet Federation provided nuclear deal to India that would act as an assurance, the then Atomic Energy Commission member, Dr. Homi Stekna, felt that the trust was missing from the Soviet side, and they were not willing to commit to just receiving a nuclear umbrella from the Soviets. Documents also want to examine how the nuclear explosion would soar national pride very high and led to a general euphoria within the populace. This was true in 1974 as well as in 1998. And with regards to the security aspect, most state the genuine self-reliance was the common theme of the state that would no longer rest on the commitment of the Soviets. This is also a common thing that came out during the interviews that I conducted during my PhD, and where the concept of self-reliance was consistently associated with strategic autonomy and sovereignty of India's nuclear program. Now, when I related to concepts of neutrality, which is something that I've done for this paper, that I'm trying to do for this paper, I was looking at how neutrality is understood in literature. So there's a lot of discussion on what types of neutrality should be there and what other conceptions, as you can see on the screen right now. But I also want to understand neutrality from the perspective of the non-aligned movement and what that represented. There are now realist conceptions of neutrality, there are constructivist conceptions of neutrality, and I think that India was trying to understand this neutrality from a perspective of strategic autonomy, where it was linking neutrality to strategic autonomy. During the World War period, for example, now we can state the neutrality was too generous for a number of states. There are underlying political forces, including geography, that shaped the political options, becoming neutral as a means of both preserving their sovereignty by appeasing the two superpowers for the logical and appropriate strategies. And this is something that we see in India's foreign policy that is consistently adopted. Even though we know that non-aligned movement was something that was very close to India, it's not that it did not engage with the United States and with the Soviet Union at different points of time as per the requirements of the day. Acceptance of neutral states by both superpowers demonstrated also mutual restraint that contributed to the overall balance of power in the region for India. When we look at NAM in the NPT then, even though in the ENDC, India, Brazil all participated very extensively, and they tried to sort of bring out a non-aligned identity, and they attempted to consolidate this non-nuclear identity around their non-aligned status, it was not a very successful mission in that sense. During the earlier meeting with the NEC, the Indian representatives condemned the continuing arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, and asserted the importance of the third side, which was evolving as a non-aligned movement. Now, the non-aligned movement, when it began, was definitely neutral in its conception. But not every state was able to live up to the ideals that were espoused in NAM, as many, including India, which I also pointed out earlier, were signed pacts with the superpowers to protect their sovereignty. But despite this fact, the concept of non-aligned movement still stayed afloat, and thus today, because of what it means for as a neutral concept for states, especially small states in that sense. But when we look at NPT and neutrality, they don't seem to fit so well, because the NPT, through the legal junction from which states do not derive sort of states into a nuclear and non-nuclear, and that clear differentiation that it does between the nuclear hierarchy that it creates does not represent the concept of neutrality. Rather than a pre-existing ordering, the distinction between nuclear and non-nuclear states was actually a product of the NPT negotiation. So neutrality within the NPT was not, according to me, a very concept that was very strongly entertained. It is also referred to as a grand bargain in some ways between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So look at India. India has discussions in the NPT, and looking at India in the non-aligned movement, it seems that India is the one that has ensured is being bound by notions of neutrality rather than the non-aligned movement and the NPT. And India's stance in both these organizations or movements, if we may, has been that of neutrality, that of promoting neutrality. Even though it is an exercise in realism, it has had a very neutral in that sense conception. And I just like to conclude by saying that something that I've already pointed out earlier was that NPT was inherently hierarchical and divisive, but it did bring about neutrality within the non-nuclear weapon states. The idea was to have within the two differences parity within them. The NAM, on the other hand, was intrinsically based on principles of mutual respect and equality. However, NAM members are often accused of betraying the concepts of values of neutrality for reasons of sovereignty. And NAM today stands very, very divided on many issues, because member states need to bring together their different conceptions of how they view neutrality within a common the common umbrella of the NAM. And whether it is the NCD discussions or participation in the NAM, India's conceptions of non-alignment and neutrality have held it in good stead in both forums. But the real question would be that how these new defense relationships that India is engaging with will open questions of its neutrality and where it stands in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kanica. And the next speaker will be Josh. So please take your 15 minutes to 18 minutes, please.
I will disconnect you now and finish the work on the YouTube, okay? And then I'll bring you back.
Okay. So, like this for you.
Thank you, Masasan. We kind of saw India's engagement with non-alignment. And the first presentation provides me a nice transition, a platform for transition to look at some of the things on what India actually did during the NPT negotiations. But before that, let me just, at the onset, thanks, or to say that it's an absolute privilege to present some of my work over here in such an august gathering. And I'm particularly thankful to the Waseda University and GRIPS for organizing this important conference and inviting me to present some of my research. And a special thanks to Pascal and Octo for their help and support in getting me over here. So today, what I'm going to do is to talk about India's engagement with the Non-Proliferation Treaty between 1964 and 1968. Now, this is not my primary area of research. I look largely at India's strategic history and India's nuclear history from the weapons program point of view. But the NPT was a significant element of the debate around India's nuclear weapons program between 64 and 68, and remained, and remained in some sense significant to it even after that, even till today, so to say. But India has also been the hardest nut to crack within the NPT, and that remained so between 1964-68 till today. It, in some sense, was a poster boy of revolution within the NPT. Now, India's disengagement with the NPT is particularly puzzling for two reasons, I would say. First of all, it was one of the most vocal supporters of disarmament in general, and maybe during the initial period of NPT negotiations also for the treaty. But why should we revisit India's engagement with the NPT? I make three claims. Claims based on evidence, claims based on arguments in the literature, but also claims on methodological bias within the scholarship. Now, when I say that, there are two things which are very, very interesting. In April 1968, as the treaty is being sent to the UN General Assembly, there is no consensus within the major branches of the Indian government on what should be India's approach to NPT. So the Committee of Secretaries, which is the highest bureaucratic committee within the Indian government, meets in March and April 1968. And now archival evidence clearly indicates that both the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Defense were in favor of signing the treaty. It was the Prime Minister's office and the scientific enclave, which is represented by the Department of Atomic Energy, which principally opposed any signing of the treaty. The second interesting element is that India did not bulldoze the treaty. And if you compare it with India's CTBT stance and India's NPT stance, the differences are very, very interesting. For the first time, India never invoked the security angle within the NPT. It remained the idea of exclusion, apartheid, unequal treatment, but never the security angle. In CTBT, it was the national security which came into, which was the fundamental, difficulty for India to sign the CTBT. But if you juxtapose India's positions in 1968 and in 1996, India is much more strong in 1968 in terms of, the literature around its capability, but also the international sympathy it had because of the China threat at that point in time. So it would have made a decision not to sign the NPT and go to develop the bomb. It could have done it much better in 1960s rather than 1990s in a sense, in terms of an argument. The paper over here is, it's a picture of a photocopy in a sense of an archival document, which is basically the instructions sent by the Principal Secretary of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to India's permanent representative in New York. And the paper is very interesting. There is no hostile opposition to the treaty. So what it outlines is that don't mention China during the NPT negotiations. Don't mention Pakistan. Don't obstruct the treaty. Let it pass, even when we don't sign it. So don't be vocal about India's opposition to the treaty, which is very, very interesting. It's kind of a, antithetical to what we generally know about India's engagement with the NPT. The second part of it is about major arguments. So there are three major arguments of why India didn't sign the NPT. One is the China threat, that there was this Chinese threat. The story is basically 1964 China test nuclear weapons. India already had a territorial dispute. There's a 1962 war, so there's a security angle, and therefore, India did not sign the NPT. The second is the nuclear security guarantees, that India couldn't obtain nuclear security guarantees from major powers, and therefore it didn't sign the NPT. The third is, which is the prestige argument, in a sense, the apartheid argument, but generally it is this, that it was a great power coalition, it was great power consensus, and therefore India would not take the word of the great powers as a matter of defiance, and as its idea of principled opposition to unequal treatment. The third set of reservations I have are theoretical and methodological. So India's not signing the NPT neatly fits into the major assumptions of IR theory and non-proliferation literature. That if proliferation is a chain reaction of fallen dominoes, then India is just a fallen domino, in a sense, and therefore India didn't sign the NPT. So there's a tyranny of theory which, forces our view, or the larger literature's view on India's engagement with the NPT. The second problem I have is methodological. So much of, and Hassan talked about this, about the US perspectives, mostly dominant perspectives on nuclear history and all that in the previous panel. But much of India's nuclear history has been written through sources in the US, British, and French archives. Now the problem is this: if China's threat perception, if India's perception of the Chinese threat is the principal motivator for India to begin a weapons program, much of that perceptions are gleaned from the literature which is available in the US or any other foreign archives. But what the Indians are telling the Americans or the Brits or the French about India's perceptions of China threat is not what they deliberate internally. So it is about how the Americans think, the Indians think about the China threat, rather than what the Indians think about the China threat. So there's a methodological problem there. And I will show that in concrete terms how it becomes a methodological problem. Maybe India deliberately wanted to exaggerate the Chinese threat. Both politically, militarily, economically, it helped India. So in my presentation today, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to look at the China threat. What did it mean for India? How it informed India's engagement with the NPT. I'll then look at the nuclear security guarantees and how India engaged the NPT and the larger nuclear security guarantees debate. And lastly, and this is something which I've been thinking about for quite some time, is that NPT as a symbol of detente, what did it mean for India? So we keep on talking about great power consensus, resulting into the NPT, and that it led to an unequal treatment. And I kind of want to forward this claim that it was as much beneficial for India as it was harmful, maybe, as the literature poses out to be. So, basically, the major argument is that there is no consensus on China threat within India. Second, that the initial response to the NPT was to see that there can be an institutional constraint on China's nuclear weapons program through the NPT. Third is that nuclear guarantees were implicit in Cold War politics for Indian decision makers. So whether they are explicit or not doesn't really matter. And this is India's reading of Cold War politics. And the fourth claim which I basically make is NPT as a symbol of the time was as much advantageous to India for strategic reasons as nobody in the literature claims to be. So here two gentlemen, this is Lal Bahadur Shastri, who takes up the baton of leadership from Nehru after Nehru dies in May 1964. He's India's second prime minister. And below him is Homi Bhabha, who's basically the father of India's nuclear program, so to say, not the weapons program. Now, what is the China threat? There is a military threat. Obviously, you have fought a 1962 war, there is territorial problems. Then there is a prestige threat. What does it mean for a third world country? And many panelists touched upon it, yesterday. What does it mean for a third world country to have a nuclear weapon? And how does it influence the third world and India's prestige and India's position in the world as such? And lastly, there's a political threat. India as a system of liberal democracy and China as a symbol of Maoist revolutionary ideology. So which system is better? And those are the three main threats which Indian decision makers kind of look around and observe as China goes nuclear. Now, the two documents there are the first two threat assessments made by Indian Foreign Office after the 16 October test by China. One is by J.S. Mehta, who later on became Foreign Secretary of India in late 1970s, but was chargé d'affaires at embassy in Beijing. Mehta basically says four things in this document. And this is a 12-page, very rigorous analysis of the Chinese, tests. He says, first of all, that the Chinese test is a result of larger domestic politics, or the politics between the communist regimes as such. So he links 16 October test with the fall of Nikita Khrushchev and the larger fight between Soviet Union and China over influence on the communist world. The second thing which he says, that developing nuclear weapons as a response to China would be a distraction. And it basically says that and last thing which it says is that India has to rely upon its great power friends, which are both Soviet Union and the US. And Mehta made this assessment on 23rd October, just 5 days after the tests. The second document is by a figure who became President of India in late 1990s, was actually President of India in 1998, when India actually tested nuclear weapons, but was a lowly bureaucratic figure in the Ministry of External Affairs at that point in time, with what was called the China Division. And his name was K.R. Narayan, and he later on became ambassador to Beijing as well as ambassador to the US. And he had a dramatically different point of view. In fact, this paper was the most comprehensive manifesto for India to go nuclear. This is again very comprehensive 12-page memo. And Narayan says, the Chinese bomb is first of all a political threat. It has special revolutionary significance because what it does is to put forward the superiority of Chinese political and social life, and therefore creates an example for Indian masses to follow the communist revolutionary ideology. And to give an idea of what was happening in domestic politics at this point in time, the Congress Party, which is the epitome, which comes out of the Indian national independence movement, is epitome of a liberal liberal party in a sense, steeped into Western democratic systems, is for the first time facing, at a political level, challenges from communist ideology, not only in terms of electoral democracy, but also revolutionary democracy. So this whole revolutionary movement, it started in 1964 called the Naxalbari movement, which split the Indian communists into those who favored the Soviet system or adhered to the Soviet ideology, and those who adhered to the Maoist ideology. The Naxalbari movement basically was a violent, violent overthrow of democratic system in India. So that was one. The second was the ripple effect the Chinese nuclear bomb would find in Asia and Africa. Basically that the Communist Party has overtaken, the Communist China has overtaken India in terms of science and development. To give you an example, 1955, India has its first research reactor. Nehru sends a note to Bhabha saying, we have taken a great lead in this important element of science and technology in the third world, and we should maintain it. So the Chinese bomb kind of signified to the world that actually the communist system can overtake a liberal democracy like India, and that it may be the better system. But also that Narayanan feared that Asia and Africa will now both respect and fear China. And there is where India's diplomatic position becomes extremely difficult. The third thing he talked about was larger international politics. That China will now join the high table. And immediately after the test, there was this whole idea from the United Nations Secretary General about meeting of the 5 nuclear powers, which basically translated into the NPT. And he called Chinese nuclear weapon a crisis in India's manifest destiny. Now there are two very opposite views over here. Who does Shastri listen to? Now let me give you an anecdote. The paper over here was leaked, Narayanan's memo was leaked to the US Embassy a day before Narayanan actually submitted it to the Ministry of External Affairs. And the state and much of the US assessments of India's nuclear weapons program and its intentions are based in this memo. So if you look at all the CIA, and many other State Department assessments, they keep on saying India will go nuclear in 1965 within a year or so. But it was deliberately leaked. I actually spoke to the diplomat who leaked it, who was Under Secretary to Narayanan at this point in time, and it was deliberately leaked. We wanted to exaggerate the Chinese threat. And I'll come to that why. So, how do you interpret threats is a fundamental point of view. Is a fundamental point over here. Especially in democratic states, where states are not black boxes. They are interest groups within states. And the threat is viewed as both risks and opportunities, depending upon where the interest group stands. And that is dependent upon two things. What are your past beliefs? And what is at stake for future? What are the opportunity costs of taking one policy over the other? And I think here is where the division was extremely clear. So who was Shastri before he became Prime Minister? He was a railway minister and a home minister. In India, nuclear policy was concentrated within the Prime Minister's office and the Department of Atomic Energy. So Shastri knows nothing about the nuclear weapons program, even when, which is contestable, Nehru would have thought about nuclear weapons at such a stage. What he knows is Nehru's commitment to disarmament. What he knows is Nehru's commitment to non-alignment and peace. The second thing Shastri is dealing with is the burden on the economy. India suffers major food crisis between 65 and 67, and that is existential threat. And all political decision makers, particularly in democracies, look at immediate problems much before then they kind of strategize for 10 years ahead. That's not their bread and butter. Their bread and butter is next election. So, in the minds of Shastri, it posed a political risk to develop weapons, because it kind of was against both its political beliefs, but also past beliefs in terms of, another fact over here is that when you step into the shoes of somebody like Nehru, you have to legitimize your policies based upon continuity from your predecessor. You can't basically claim that you will have a completely new policy. There is a Nehruvian consensus. Scientific enclave, on the other hand, sees it as an opportunity because of its organizational ambitions. But also for the first time, the US is willing to give India certain things which it never before. So the Gilpatrick Committee actually talks about, if you look at the Gilpatrick Committee, December 1964, they talk about cooperation with India on the whole range of plutonium economy, which includes peaceful nuclear experiments. And Bhabha at that point in time also asked for maritime reactors. So he just wanted to extend more and more. Lastly is the military. Military sees nuclear weapons as a distraction from the conventional build-up after the 1962 war. As a conventional organization, military is only looking at conventional threats. So military makes a threat assessment in December 1964, calls the Chinese threat a long-term nuclear threat, a long-term nuclear threat. The immediate need was to build up conventionally. So who does Shastri side with? So what this leads to is a compromise. Shastri gives a go-ahead in terms of theoretical research on nuclear weapons. But his political response is to go for nuclear security guarantees. Because at least that makes him, that gives an idea that he's doing something about it. Okay. And these threat assessments have been there all through. So this is a 1973 threat assessment in May 1973. And the line which is highlighted over there basically tells that there is no possibility of China using nuclear weapons. So just give you an example that all through the Chinese threat and the Indian perceptions was that China will not use nuclear weapons against India. The nuclear security guarantees. Now this is a political response from Shastri to what he thinks Bhabha is pushing him to take a decision on nuclear weapons. It is a political decision to come out of the bomb convention. And in 1964 itself, early 65, they prepare this whole idea. This is a draft treaty, draft declaration which they prepare for all the three major powers, but never send it to either Washington or Britain or to Soviet Union, because they think it's not going to happen, primarily because of Russia or Soviet Union. Soviet Union thought that nuclear security guarantees are an invitation to the US to come into the Indian Ocean. And for India, Detente was extremely important. Because if the whole idea was to isolate China, then coming together of these two powers was extremely important. And participating in the NPT was also a result of that idea. So by 1966, Shastri dies, and then immediately after Bhabha dies, there's a political transition. Again, India is much more involved within domestic politics. But again, this whole idea of nuclear security guarantees get a boost in 1967. And this is, again, not about security as such. This is about avoiding the bomb. And it is not Indira Gandhi who initiates this whole idea of nuclear security guarantees again. It is Sarabhai, who is principally opposed, unlike Bhabha, to nuclear weapons program. Doesn't really happen. But what is India's idea at this point in time? So the final argument which is given by Indira Gandhi's principal secretary is that, yes, we will not have explicit security guarantees. But the Cold War politics inherently provides India implicit security guarantees. And why? This is because Indian decision makers had a very different view of deterrence. The idea was that if an element of risks is evident in Beijing's mindset, that if it blackmails India or uses nuclear weapons, that great powers would retaliate, then that risk is sufficient, rather than the credibility of great power response or India's credibility to respond. And in any case, no alliance has a full-proof credibility of response in any case. So why should we give up our non-alignment when you have really, have the best of both the worlds, in a sense? So lastly, in terms of NPTs as detente, is extremely important. Why? Because I feel that since NPT was the major, or the only major substantive issue on which great powers came in together, it was important for India to continue to have that detente in place. Why? Lessons from the first China war. Why does First China War happens in November 1960, October 1962 and November 1962? Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mao thinks that Soviet Union has to support Chinese because of the dissonance between great powers. And that is the lesson India learns from 1962 war. Nehru's idea of forward defense policy in provoking China was basically that if China attacks India, then there would be a world war because Soviet Union and America would come to India's help. He overstated his case, much because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the lesson which India learned out of the Cuban Missile Crisis and 1962 war was that if India has to have that traction and deter China, it has to have Soviet Union and America come together. So in 1963, it actually asked for joint conventional guarantees from both the Soviet Union and the US. Indira Gandhi, as Nehru's daughter and broadcasting minister, went to Moscow in summer 1963 and proposed this idea to Khrushchev. It never came through. So as far as it represented the idea of the Khan, India continued to negotiate with it and literally didn't bulldoze the treaty, so to say. So to give an example, India's nuclear weapons program, so to say, doesn't really build up even after the signing of the treaty. The decision is taken by Indira Gandhi after the Bangladesh war in 1971, which is very, very confusing in a sense. That if NPT is so central and nuclear security guarantees are so central, then why do you do it in 1971? But also, if you look at India's nuclear weapons program holistically, 71, there is the whole idea to test. 74, there's a peaceful nuclear explosion. What does an explosion mean if it is not followed by weaponization? As Thomas was saying yesterday, everyone who thought about nuclear weapons also thought about strategizing, weaponizing, how do you use it? Concomitant delivery vehicles. There is no discussion in India on that. There is nothing to accompany that. And weaponization is a more difficult part than just testing. It requires a lot more of hardware and software to put it as a deterrent rather than anything else. And India doesn't do that till 1988. And I can talk about it why it does that. So in my sense that there is an element to revise of how India is engaging with the NPT. And it is not, this whipping boy which India has always whipped for all kinds of reasons, but there's an inherent element of advantage which NPT gave India and what India's engagement with the NPT talked about. I'll just stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much for another. Thank you. Thank you for another fascinating presentation. I'll give you some questions later on. So, Nidhi, mic is yours.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Good morning, everyone present here. That was a really intense presentation. The shift from there to this. Okay, so my name is Nidhi Parasad. I'm originally from India and I'm doing my PhD here in Japan at Rakhra University. And I want to start off by saying I'm so humbled to be a part of this conference because just looking at the kind of expertise and the historians and it's just amazing to learn so much from here. And I also want to thank the organizers for this panel. It's amazing for students like us to get access to present and learn from other scholars as well, and learn how to conduct research better, I guess. So yeah, thank you. And India and Japan, nuclear choices and international security. And to start off with why India and Japan, since the session is on South Asia and we're looking at NAM. I guess to start off with, I come from an international relations background, and my research here is focused on understanding the US-Japan security alliance and the concept of the nuclear umbrella or nuclear deterrence in the security alliance, and how does Japan understand that in its security policy. So that's what my research is focused on, but at the same time, I'm also curious and stuff like learning about deepening India-Japan relations, and studying here in classroom debates, often the question, you become the representative unofficially of your country, and you're asked like, what about India's choices? And so just understanding how does India, how do you compare India and Japan's understanding nuclear choices and its security perspective? So I just thought this is a study of curious exploration, I guess. And what's interesting about India and Japan is that they're both located in tense neighborhoods. We can say that they emerged on opposite sides of the Cold War. India, as we know, pursued the path of non-alignment, and Japan aligned with the United States and supported, was under the US nuclear umbrella. So again, two sides during the Cold War, and were their paths to security similar or different, and how do we understand that? I guess that's what the presentation attempts to look at. So my research objective is to compare India and Japan's paths towards security vis-a-vis the pursuit or contemplation of nuclear choice. I guess nuclear choice here refers to nuclear weapons acquisition, and the assumption that the possession of the weapon or the bomb would increase their sense of security. For Japan, I guess the case was the contemplation of nuclear weapons, and what would that mean for their security. So I guess this question is then motivated or can be explained by two factors. One is, how does a nation view itself? How does the role of a self-image or the identity of a nation, and those questions about that impact, I guess, these choices. And the second is also the perception of the international order. How does a state view itself, and how does it view the international order, and how do you engage with that? How does possession of a nuclear weapon then change that for you? So I guess this is the outline of my presentation. Talk about self-image or identity. I think something that was mentioned yesterday, and I'd like to again bring it up, was that India, as we know, emerged from colonial rule from the British, and its nationhood, I guess, is steeped in fighting against other colonial intentions, supporting, unifying other decolonial movements, colonization movements around Asia and Africa, and that kind of was rooted in that idea of nationhood and survival, if you will. Again, for Japan, in that sense, Japan emerged defeated after the Second World War, after horrendous nuclear attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and under US occupation then until 1951. And so again, both countries then having to rebuild, I guess, from the scratch what it means to be a nation, and then looking at democratic institutions as fledgling as they were. And I guess this then shapes how the country looks at its own foreign policy, and what ideas does it espouse, and what ideas does it proclaim or project to sort of guide its foreign policy. So again, the idea of a self-image or identity then guiding that. And so just to compare India and Japan, I guess for India we can say why the choice of non-alignment, and what did that promise. So India, newly independent, not aligning with either power blocks, the West or the East. Yogesh, I guess, brought it up as well. Was this policy true to its intent? So did Kanica. The idea of being neutral in a bipolar environment, what does that mean? Not aligned. So Prime Minister Nehru once said they refrained from engaging in power politics. That's India's opinion. But as we can see, eventually India did seek aid from the United States in 1962 during the Sino-Indian War, and then also signed the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Soviet Union in 1971. So this behavior then doesn't fit with its so-called moral principles of non-alignment as such. So non-alignment, I guess, for India then meant, in terms of foreign policy alignment, supportive of anti-colonial struggles and broader Asian-African unity, as it were. Now, when it comes to Japan, why the choice of alignment? And I think, as I mentioned, post-US occupation, the three things that are interlinked is the idea of Japan setting up its constitution, emerging as its democratic institutions, emerging as a nation, is linked to US military occupation. The US military as an important institution that sort of shapes the debates for Japan, and what would its constitution look like, what would the role of force be like, and again with relation to role of force, then what would the role of nuclear weapons be like. And so the question on the use of military impacted Article 9 and impacted the debates on nuclear possession. Again, this was a period when we're all familiar with the Hibakusha community within Japan, and post Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we know the kind of nuclear allergy, as researchers call it, but the kind of pacifism which was rooted in the civil society and rooted in the attitudes from there, not just even scientists and other communities, and even the citizens that were very, you could say, averse to any idea of having nuclear weapons stored, in Japan. So neutrality, again, what's interesting is Japan during the 1950s and 60s, the conservative right had held power, but in opposition were the left, the Japan Socialist Party and the Communist Party, and the Japan Communist Party argued for a policy of neutralism, and this was again in the context of unarmed neutrality, which meant that not align with either the Americans or the Soviet Union and sort of be friendly to all. And this kind of unarmed neutrality represented the position of the left within Japan in the 1960s. So I guess when in terms of concepts, India, non-alignment, and Japan, then saying neutrality was a concept that featured. So how did this understanding influence their contemplation or pursuit of the nuclear choice? The Indian side of it, Yogesh has dealt with very succinctly and even deconstructed so many aspects of it. But if you look at the focus on civil nuclear energy, and the kind of relationship that Prime Minister Nehru and Homi Bhabha, the nuclear physicist, had in terms of setting up the Energy Commission in India and setting up the technology and the expertise for nuclear energy, and how energy was a driving force for looking at India's economic and energy were like the two important security objectives that drove its civil nuclear program. And I guess questions about linking principles of non-alignment with the pursuit of bomb. This is again going back to Yogesh's presentation, very deconstructed, the three different arguments. So I guess these are some of the so-called arguments. That one is the prestige that could come with getting the bomb, and then 1962 war with China, and at the same time, India's appeal to the United States for aerial assistance, but that was denied because, that couldn't be answered because the US was preoccupied with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I guess for Nehru, this was a big defeat for his policy of non-alignment. And then China's nuclear test in 1964. And I guess a lot of literature has looked at domestic political groups or political opposition and what role do they have in terms of influencing the elite's choice on nuclear policy. I think in India as well, we had the Jan Sangha party, this Swatantrata party that called for India's development of weapons. Again, the whole idea of nuclear security guarantee brought up by Yogesh. So this was again an issue in 1966 and 1967. And with respect to the NPT, again India's argument being haves versus the have-nots, and eventually in 1974 when the peaceful nuclear exposition was conducted. Now in Japan, the case is really interesting, and I'm quite fascinated with it, is that the domestic groups were divided with left and right, and after the Atoms for Peace proposal, Japan was then pursued its civil nuclear program with a very focused manner, and they have one of the most sophisticated programs, and I guess one of the few within US allies or within the extended adherents, like under the members of the nuclear umbrella with the United States, they are the only ones that have plutonium reprocessing facilities, and a lot of literature talks about this possession as being a latent capability that Japan has. Well, it has the technology to go nuclear, but it hasn't expressed the intent to do so. And this kind of latency or nuclear hedging that a lot of scholars link that. What's interesting is for Japan, its concerns over its security was met by the alliance with the United States, and its concerns over energy was met with its civil nuclear program. And what happened was having plutonium reprocessing capability then helped it develop a hedge in the case of if the US credibility of the nuclear umbrella is either doubted or so having that kind of framework in place, it helped Japan, I guess, during the Cold War keep aside its disarmament and deterrence goals. And it's only now when you see that the neatly divided categories are now being sort of modeled again. And what's interesting is in 1964, when China did go nuclear, after that it was Prime Minister Sato Eisaku in Japan who was then considering what Japan's choice would be, and apparently in December 1968 he did speak to the United States ambassador hinting that Japan can go nuclear if it wants to. And then this then changed the debate within Japan, because what happened was Prime Minister Sato then he assigned the Cabinet Research Information Committee to conduct a secret study of what would the costs of going nuclear be. And in the 1970s, 1968 to 1970, there was a secret study conducted under the Sato administration, and they looked at what the technological, economic, and security costs of that, of going nuclear would be. And they found out that it would be not only economically costly, it would also be Japan. A lot of scholars point out how its strategic depth is less and how having capabilities would actually make it more vulnerable. And so, again, against China as well, the Chinese threat. So these were the arguments raised. And what Prime Minister Sato did was then he, I think, went to Lyndon Johnson in a meeting in private and discussed that could Japan gain security assurances from the United States. And that's when in private it was the United States, again, Lyndon Johnson administration agreed to it. And it was only after that, then in 1967, did Japan say that, did Prime Minister Sato then in the Diet say that, okay, we at Japan espouses to 3 non-nuclear principles, which is Japan will not possess, manufacture, or station nuclear weapons on its soil. And for it to say those 3 non-nuclear principles, but it meant that on the backdoor channels there were other security guarantees being met. But having this divide, it helped contain the domestic opposition as well. At the same time, its security needs were met. So, I mean, this is something that we can look at Japanese behavior and again question it. Is in a year after that, in the New Year's speech in December 1960, later when Prime Minister Sato then said that he described the 4 pillars of Japan's security, and the first one he said that the 3 non-nuclear principles were important. The second, he openly declared that external deterrence offered by the United States was an important aspect or important pillar of Japan's security. Third, he said an important policy is promoting nuclear disarmament, and fourth, he said peaceful use of nuclear energy. So that was for the first time the explicit mention by a Japanese Prime Minister about nuclear deterrence being, extended nuclear deterrence being a pillar for security for Japan. So 3 principles, but 4 pillars. So the perception of the international order and role in it, this, I know in the abstract, and I did want to have sort of an understanding of how nations like India and Japan and their nuclear choices are defined by, we can say, regional security environments, and how do they perceive the international order. And I wanted to connect the international order in the Cold War, we can say, a bipolarity, and are international security orders different from nuclear orders, or how do nuclear weapons engage with international orders? Because for countries like Japan, bipolarity was reality, and they were under the deterrence, the nuclear umbrella of the United States. But for the United States, extending that umbrella to Japan was also part of its non-proliferation policy, because the United States, it didn't want its own allies to go nuclear. So the deterrence structure was also a non-proliferation structure in that sense. This is in the case of Japan, but then for India, I mean, there are articles that Japan believes NPT is also an important part of the order, or a pillar of the order. But for countries like India as well, NPT, as even Yogesh pointed out in his hypothesis, that it's a reflection of detente, or is NPT just a regime and not, India doesn't look at it as part of a fundamental order as such. So this is something that I'm still looking at, and this will probably extend into during the Cold War, end of Cold War. So yeah, and again, regional geopolitics and how superpowers' intervention or role in regional geopolitics then also guide or drive ambitions for these players. So, in conclusion, I just want to state that India and Japan both, we can say, questioned each other's moral high ground. So Japan says that India's choice to go nuclear, despite being non-aligned, chose deterrence over disarmament. And some Indian scholars have looked at Japan's choice not to go nuclear and said that's a convenient position because Japan could advocate nuclear disarmament while relying on the protection of the US nuclear umbrella. So when we look at these narratives around ideology, like neutralism or non-alignment, are these ideological principles then just cushioned with realist, concerns over security, a balance of power, capabilities, narratives? So are these principles then just used by third world countries or smaller countries? Are these principles just used to pursue realist goals ultimately? That can be a question. Again, external events for both countries drove domestic debates. This is up to the 1970s, we've spoken about Sino-Indian War and nuclear test and debates on NPT signature within India. And for Japan as well, the debates on NPT signature was a big time divide between the left and the right. Again, in the 1990s, India's decision to go nuclear in 1998, and apparently in Japan in 1990s, another domestic study was conducted on the feasibility of going nuclear. This was after North Korea was developing capabilities, and Japan again was reconsidering or thinking what the calculations were. And this was just before agreeing to permanently extend the NPT. So for both countries, state perception external events were really important. I guess since we are here and we are looking at new narratives or new histories or finding out new stories from other countries, third world countries, with respect to the nuclear bomb, I guess, there are diversity of opinions and different cultural backgrounds, and each country has its own unique historical experience, but are all trajectories about nuclear choices ultimately about survival? This is something that I'm just thinking about, but yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Nidhi, especially you were touched on the Japanese nuclear history a little bit. That's my main theme. I wrote a dissertation here in GRIPS 10 years ago, and that's my also study earlier. So each time Japanese Prime Minister faced the new President of the United States, like Mr. Abe facing President Trump 3 years ago, first thing Japanese Prime Minister has to do is, approaching the U.S. and make sure that the nuclear guarantee, the positive security assurance is still functioning. That's always the, first thing for Japanese Prime Minister to do is the new President of the United States. So that's the reason why February 2017, just 1 month after the inauguration of President Trump, Prime Minister Abe went to Washington, and both leaders issued a joint declaration. U.S. President said, U.S. would defend Japan by all military means, including nuclear and conventional capabilities, period. So she said in 1965, a year after, nuclear explosion by China, then Prime Minister Sato went to Washington and asked the same thing. President Johnson, we don't have any nuclear weapon at all. We can do that if we want, but we don't do that. So please, I need your guarantee. And Johnson said, I guarantee you. I read the, declassified document of both U.S. and Japan. And 2 years later, 1967, Sato repeats the same request. President, you said to me 2 years ago, you gave me a guarantee, so please, reaffirm this guarantee. That was in 1967. And then written document, first time between US and Japan is in 1975. Exact date of the 30 years anniversary of the A-bomb dropping on Hiroshima, August 6, 1975. First document coming out from the both government, US and Japan, joint press statement by President Ford and the Prime Minister Nikki. This is a deal. Japan would sign up, Japan will ratify the NPT in return for that. Now, on the written document, US can guarantee the Japanese security. Implicit nuclear punishment if any nation invaded Japan by both convention or nuclear capability. So, okay, so my first question would be, security guarantees. Both presenters discussed about it, okay? And you say Josh, you say the 1963 India, requested both capital, Moscow and Washington, joint conventional guarantees. Could you elaborate here? I'm not familiar with this specific issue, but what kind of arrangement or guarantee Indian leadership is thinking about, envisioning? What kind of arrangement, nuclear positive assurance or nuclear negative security assurance? And Kosygin made his own proposal in 1966, negative security assurance. So could you elaborate what kind of arrangement was, India pursued in the early 1960s? It's the same timing Chinese is building up their nuclear capability, and the first explosion in 1964. That was a shocking event for Japanese leadership. But you said, no consensus about the threat, coming from a Chinese. So. Also, if you can, you didn't mention at all P word, Pakistan. So, could you mention what their motivation of the India to go nuclear, vis-a-vis Pakistan? Could you elaborate? Maybe this might be a 1970s story, I guess. So if you can touch on that, and Nidhi, it's very good presentation, and you very precisely analyze also Japanese nuclear policy, and during current Prime Minister Abe made a historical agreement with India for the first time for peaceful nuclear cooperation between two nations. NPT, India is outside of NPT, so there is still some nuclear allergy among the Japanese public for promoting the peaceful nuclear cooperation with India. Even we know that India is a key nation, and India should play a role as a counterweight against China. Especially Prime Minister's government is putting a heavy weight on the Indians' potential role to deter China. So that's the reason why Japan, US, and also Australia and India, these four nations are trying to make a new coalition. We are not gonna specifically say China is a threat, but the strong indication is we have to build up the kind of a new deterrent structure in this region vis-a-vis China. So what's your, in the nuclear context, Japan provide the nuclear cooperation with India, and also we have to be concerned about the repercussion coming from Pakistan. Pakistan has been also outside NPT, and Pakistan is blocking a conference disarmament argument about the FMCT, Fissile Material Cut-off Treaty. So one of the reasons why still Pakistan is resisting the negotiation of the FMCT, the bilateral nuclear cooperation with India from the other nation like US, France, and the UK, and also Japan. So at the current context and what do you think about the peaceful nuclear cooperation between two nations, especially India and Japan, would give some kind of repercussion of the negative influence, or maybe some positive influence among the entire security environment in this region? Okay, that's my question. And finally, Kanica, it's very conceptual argument you made on you say the clarity of neutrality needed to be redefined really explain the neutrality of India and your presentation at the touch on the maybe it is time for India to redefine the what's the neutrality. As I explained many Japanese people don't think India a neutral nation. Pro-democracy, and we are working together on many fronts, and the more tilting toward the Western democratic society, and we expect a lot India for kind of a counterweight against China, as I mentioned. So in this context of the power struggle, power game, power competition among the major players in this region, how you can redefine the neutrality of India? That's my question. So who's gonna go first? Who wanna do first?
Anyone you want to. So Nidhi.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Oda-sensei, for your questions. So starting off with India and Japan peaceful nuclear cooperation, what's interesting was in 1998 when India conducted its nuclear test, Japan, and this was the time when Indo-Japanese relations were cordial but not very substantial, and this was the time when the Japanese had a very strong negative, very strong criticism against India, and I actually have some proof here, so the government of Japan then, in 2 stages, announced economic measures. The Japanese government froze grant aid, it froze aid for new projects, except humanitarian projects, but it suspended yen loans and again, withdrawal of Tokyo as a venue for the India Development Forum. So a lot of economic harsh measures, you can say, sanctions were used against India at this time. Even in the United Nations, along with Sweden and I think Costa Rica or Slovenia, this is the UN Security Resolution in 1172. They argued very strongly condemning India and Pakistan for the nuclear tests and said that this is intolerable, it's a challenge to the international society. And so this was the time when India then looked at Japanese strong criticism and then felt this is when India questioned its moral stance, and the ties went kind of sour for a few years. And it was only after 2000s when Prime Minister Modi later visited India, and then the United States then and India, over the series of negotiations they had, I think US's engagement with India then shaped Japan's approach towards India eventually. And it was only in 2007 or 8 when Prime Minister Koizumi visited India, and then the bilateral partnership became more strategic in nature. And this was around the same time when China, the rise of China and the threat perception in Japan was growing stronger. And again, we have Prime Minister Abe visiting India, saying confluence of 2 seas in India and Japan, then formulate this arc of democracy connecting India, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, and other things. And we should all, maritime democracies, should sort of come together and work together to sort of work against, he didn't say this explicitly, but limit China's rise as a world. So it was only after 2007-8, and in the last decade, we actually see very strong, from economic ties. It started off as an economic partnership, and then the strategic dimensions became stronger. And it's only now, I think, again, when India conducted its nuclear test, this is something I read, I haven't gone into it deeply, but India's defense minister then, George Fernandez, came to Japan, and he had a long interview with Asahi TV and explaining India's position, and I think that changed the debate within Japan, at least from the civil society, and how they view India. But even in 2011, again, the other thing that happened in Japanese policy was this whole Indo-Pak hyphenation, the de-hyphenation of Japan's relations with India from Pakistan. Again, separating those two, that meant a lot for India as well, and that's when Indo-Japanese relations became stronger and then more strategic in nature. And that's why now when you see, in this context, when you see their security partnership becoming stronger, we can see that the once negative criticisms or opinions that Japan had, at least from a political or strategic aspect, is declining or decreasing. And security environment becoming more adversarial around Japan. Again, this is again within the Japanese domestic civil society, but this whole deterrence versus disarmament debate in Japan is also rising. So we're at a brink of, I guess, a new juncture in the relationship. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Masa-san, for those very interesting questions. So, the first time India, so these are feelers. You know, what India is asking about Soviet Union and US for conventional guarantees are feelers. They're not as if India has prepared a plan how these are going to happen. And the feelers were sent to both US as well as Soviet Union in 1963. To the US, it was parliamentarian Ghosh, I don't remember the first name, who went there. To the Soviet Union, Indira Gandhi, daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, as the information broadcasting minister, went along with T.N. Kaul, who was India's ambassador to Moscow. And Khrushchev literally, basically said, no, this won't happen. We'll help you with your conventional build-up and all that. Now, what security guarantees, why that is important is for 3 or 4 reasons. First of all, these are shared understandings. Whether they are written down in pen and paper is something very, very different. And that is also because, you know, in a sense that it completely goes against India's professed policy of non-alignment. And, you know, you are in a non-alignment trap, literally. And I call it a non-alignment trap. Because domestically you cannot sell it because of the opposition within the Congress party in a sense. But also, your whole diplomacy which is built upon this idea completely crumbles down. You know, so there is this real push of, in some sense, you know, between real polity as far as you can go, and then the sense of idealism and diplomatic alignments which you have made for last 15 years of your policy. And therefore, if you really can't have these in pen and paper, then detente becomes extremely important. And that is what India learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. It learned. So the fundamental assumption was India was too important for China to invade India and for the great powers to stand by. This is the fundamental assumption. Even in some sense, India's exceptionalism today is also informed by that. You know. But the lesson which was learned was not that the great powers will not help, but that the situation in October, November 1964 was as such that they couldn't. So you are not, you know, even after the 1962 war, when Soviet Union literally basically backs China's claims, you know, rather than, and US helps, you're not questioning the fundamental premise, you're questioning the environment. And therefore the terms becomes very important. You have to maintain that situation, you have to create that environment in which your assumptions can actually come true. So it's a very interesting, you know, angle of looking at things. Second, that detente is also important for India's conventional build-up. Now what you learn is China actually accepts use of force. It is not an irrational actor. And this is the fundamental difference between India's perceptions of China and Pakistan. It may be a revisionist actor, but it is a rational actor. Pakistan, on the other hand, is a unlimited ends revisionist, which is also not a rational actor. You know, those are two fundamentally different things. So China understands use of force. Pakistan doesn't. And therefore you have to internally build up your strength. And for both Soviet Union and US were important. 1963, India goes for the first time for Soviet MiGs, while it is also building up a defense plan with US. So if you cannot actually do this, then real politics becomes very important. So when the Soviets tell India that we won't sign the unilateral guarantees at the same time because US will come into Indian Ocean, it is because Soviet Union actually can't come into Indian Ocean. They only come to Indian Ocean in 1968. They don't really have the capability. But then they think that US Polaris submarines would, you know, they will be an additional vector to attack the Soviet Union. But then India shifts to a very realpolitik policy. So I'll give you examples of that. So 1964 Cairo Declaration was the first time Indian Ocean Zone of Peace was, you know, accepted by the non-aligned movement. By 1965 January, March, there's a major discussion. And India says, internally within the NEA, that if Bandara Naike in Sri Lanka doesn't want Diego Garcia. We also don't want Bloc Nord, which is on India's northern borders. And US presence at least creates a perceptual deterrence in the minds of the Chinese. So India actually invites US into the Indian Ocean. And similarly is the policy of Diego Garcia. So let me reiterate what is happening on nuclear security guarantees over here. 64, early 65, India's assumption is NPT will take a long time to negotiate. But for the meanwhile, we can ask for unilateral security guarantees jointly declared by all the three powers. That doesn't happen. So what is the fallback option? The fallback option is NPT will institutionalize nuclear security guarantees. And one of the 5 major demands which India makes in ENDC in 65 somehow is basically around nuclear security guarantees. So there's an idea that NPT will institutionalize. Coalition proposal comes in 1966. India realizes institutionalization of nuclear security guarantees won't happen. But even then, the principal secretary to Indira Gandhi basically says that the Cold War politics will take care of it. You know, that the alignment is such that implicit security guarantees will happen. 67, they say the same thing. In 1970, top secret threat assessments made by Principal Secretary Rakhra and Vikram Sarabhai. To paraphrase, it says this: just as India cannot be sure that US and USSR will intervene, so does China, that if it actually blackmails or uses nuclear weapons, that US and USSR will not intervene. And therefore, the risk in Beijing's mind is more than enough to deter it.
Kanica, please. Wait a second.
Okay.
Okay, now we can hear you. Yes, please.
Okay. So my question was on India's concept of neutrality. You're right about that there is definitely more relationship building with Japan, and there is more relationship building with Australia and the Western democracies that we term them. But we should also, but I'm going to refer back to what the External Affairs Minister, Mr. S. Jaishankar, recently said, was about every state in today's day is a frenemy, which is you're the friend and the enemy in the day and age. So it's not that India is not going to engage with China and it's not going to engage with Russia anymore, because Russia is an old friend for India in that sense. And one example that I'd like to bring about is what you refer to the civil nuclear cooperation. India is the only country where you have Russia also as a civil nuclear partner, as well as the United States as a civil nuclear partner. I mean, I don't know whether Turkey still has both of them in the fray right now, but it seems to me that only India is the one place where these both countries have come together, albeit on separate nuclear power plants, but of course to still work on civil nuclear cooperation with India.
All right, so thank you very much. So the rest of the time is yours. So please, sorry, I found him first. So please go ahead, Hassan.
Right. Thank you very much. This was a great panel. Joshi, I think your analysis makes perfect sense to me, and thank you for sort of highlighting this, the tension between guarantees and non-alignment, and sort of the idea of feelers versus actually serious kind of propositions. And I think I've always found the counter-argument not really convincing, and I think what you're presenting makes perfect sense to me. I found interesting some of the discussions about the Indian perceptions of Chinese threats, specifically how some arguments are construed sort of in perfect bureaucratic politics way to lead to completely different sort of policy actions depending on where they come from and which part of government they come from. And interestingly also, I find some of these discussions and rationale in the Egyptian sort of assessment of what Israel might or might not do, and the idea of implicit security guarantee as well is something that paradoxically, as a non-aligned country thinking, just the whole premise is against bloc politics, but at the same time, one of the spin-offs is that you get something out of it, and that works for you. My question for you specifically is about detente. Because my understanding of how detente was perceived in the Middle East was skeptical. And I find it very refreshing that you see it seen differently in India's case. So basically, if the great powers would agree, would definitely they agree against our interests. While you're presenting it from the Indian perspective as something that you can actually get some benefits out of. I mean, beyond just like the rhetorical, good relations and peace. It's just like that you can actually rely on some kind of like great power detente. So I want to push you further on that and clarify what you actually, whether that is like what you wanted to say and your thoughts about the difference between that and possibly how it's perceived somewhere else and the tension between that and non-alignment.
Thank you. A couple of observations. What I can identify here is in the discussion we have different types of nuclear coercion here. Especially you, Mr. Otto, pointed out that Japan is always threatening to develop a nuclear bomb to involve the US. So Japan did it all the time to various US administrations. And yet, probably Japan is still doing it, so just as South Korea might do it. So it might go nuclear if you don't, if you remove the nuclear umbrella. So we have a different kind of nuclear coercion here. Anna Mart said South Africa, when it had a bomb, first would notify the US. That's kind of nuclear coercion, so to involve the US, otherwise we might demonstrate or even use the nuclear bomb. We know from Israel that Israel did the same thing, 67, but especially 73, that said, when we have sent to the US, we have the nuclear bomb, so if you're not going to help us against the Arab armies, we might use them. So that's a sort of nuclear coercion as well. So India did it in the past as well, so with a request of nuclear security guarantees. But is there evidence that India is doing what Israel did once it has a bomb? So we might use the bomb if the US doesn't come to our aid. The problem is that Pakistan might use the same nuclear coercion towards the US as well when push comes to shove. Another remarkable observation what I saw here, that nuclear weapons do not deter conventional attacks. That was not the case in Israel, 73, and it was not the case in 99, India, Pakistan, when both countries already tested the bomb. One more question, because you mentioned the UN resolution. Nori, you mentioned UN resolution 1172. Why was it never implemented? It was not only a condemnation, it was Pakistan and India were prohibited or were requested that they stop all nuclear activities, and they were imposed sanctions. So the resolution is still in place, but it was never implemented.
First round. This is first round.
Thanks for the questions, Hassan. I completely agree. So what is happening with Titan? When I say that, I don't have a definitive answer, so to say, and the evidence also, in a sense, is sketchy at this point in time. But these are my readings of what I see the central glue, which is holding together this very bizarre turn of events, But what I understand, the tongue, is that from the very beginning, from the very beginning, Nehru's conception is basically that this is a bipolar world order. There are two great powers. And for a country like India, there are certain assumptions which are always there. First is there is an inherent importance of India, as any other country would do. That's not typical to India, but there is a heightened sense of that. Second is to avoid choice because you are a marginal player anyways. And the third is how do you manage the fluidity of Cold War politics? And this is not about ideals of not making choice, of basically maintaining stability and all that. They have concrete, tangible results on ground. So how does India develop? India develops when it gets aids from both sides. How does India develop? When it doesn't get entrapped into a major world war, something like that. So they had real tangible issues involved. And that is all coming from a deliberate strategic choice in some sense, where you want to see India. And therefore, Detente, from the very beginning, is extremely important. From the very beginning. But particularly so after India finally gets a jolt after the 1962 war. Because that's the premise, that's the fundamental premise, that India is too important, India can manage the Cold War politics, and people will, eventually great powers will come to help people. And that appears to me as something which is a thread, which is right there from the beginning when India starts negotiating the NPT, or even the ENDC for that, the partial test ban treaty. Why do you want to involve yourself in partial test ban treaty? At the end of the day, because you want that stability in the system. So you're making the best out of the given situation, given your interests. And that situation is more or less clear that it's a bipolar world order, there are two great powers, and your fundamental interests is getting these great powers to at least ensure that you are not threatened to the level of your survival becomes an important, there are threats to your survival. So in terms of NPT, I think that India wanted to negotiate it, did negotiate it. And towards the end, really, when you see the documents, you feel like that there is a soft angle to it. It is not as harsh as we have been, reading in the literature. And there is division. There is division within the government. I'm not sure why, there might be issues of prestige involved. India would not have wanted to give it in. I have my different ideas about it, but when it comes to NPT as such, I think the Indians have made it as a whipping boy, whereas you were actually acquiring during the negotiations and even after that certain advantages to it, from it. What happens as Detente breaks down, and particularly with the US shift towards China, India balances that shift by actually aligning with the Soviet Union. So if you see from 1969 onwards, as China, as US moves towards China, India moves towards the Soviet Union. But to give a different fact over here, very interesting fact, is the first time Soviets proposed the Treaty of Friendship to India, which India signed in August 1971, was in March 1969, a week after Ussuri River clashes. India didn't sign it for 2 years. It signed it only in 1971, and when, basically, to paraphrase L.K. Jha, who was ambassador to the US, was when he told the American decision makers that non-alignment is not a holy grail, which we have confined ourselves to. When it comes to our survival, we will basically, choose what we choose. The second thing is, I don't understand the connection between India and Israel, but nuclear weapons don't deter conventional wars. And that was India's fundamental premise from the very beginning. So to just again paraphrase from a 1970 threat assessment, when some of the Indian politicians were making claims that India should develop tactical nuclear weapons, there's a very interesting line in that memo where it says, as soon as the first country goes tactical, the losing country would go strategic. It's as simple as that. So there is no point going tactical.
Or geopolitical.
Yeah. But this is what is interesting, what happens after 1980s. So India's my major argument basically is that India's nuclear weapons program is fundamentally against Pakistan rather than China. China's principal folly was basically supporting Pakistani program in late 1970s and early 1980s. If China would not have done that, we might not have seen a nuclear India. Especially because India's perception of Pakistan and India's perception of China are very, very different. To again give an example, have been nuclear powers. Not a single time, there have been clashes on the border time and again. Not a single point in time, Chinese leadership or the Indian leadership has invoked nuclear weapons. Contrast it with India and Pakistan. A single thing which happens on the border and there are ideas of nuclear weapons being used and all that. Because India thinks China very differently from how it thinks about Pakistan. And this is a result of history, beliefs, ideology, and many other things.
Thank you so much for your questions. With respect to nuclear weapons not deterring conventional attacks, I think in the case of Japan, what's interesting is that this assumption prevailed during the Cold War that the nuclear umbrella would be enough, but it's only recently with China's maritime coercion as well as North Korea's capabilities, I think that there are some scholarly works now reconsidering the issue of strategic instability-stability paradox with India and Pakistan. Does that case apply to Japan and China over the maritime dispute? I haven't read too much into it, but this is something that I guess even in East Asia they're now trying to reconsider. And I guess more questions about what Japan can do then to secure itself, especially in a sub-conventional level. With respect to the UNSC resolution 1172, I'm sorry, that's something I didn't look into it as to why it didn't get passed. Maybe I can learn from you about that one. But.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gardner. I just want to share with you my small anecdote. You touched on the South Koreans, and the 2 or 3 weeks after President Obama made a historical speech at the parade, he said a nuclear-free world. Coincidentally, Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea accidentally sent the same message to Mr. Obama. Nuclear-free world will be fine. That means eliminating a nuclear umbrella. Both leaders emphasize the president, we need a steel umbrella. So same message was accidentally sent, no collaboration between two nations. So anyway, so second round, please raise your hand. Sorry, Kanica.
Yeah.
And I'm very sorry, but at 1 o'clock we have to go for lunch. Otherwise, people are going to starve. So Kanica, you have the first word and you have the last word. We can hear you again.
Okay, I'm going to be brief because obviously I'm not speaking for that. Just to make a comment on the India and Israel nuclear doctrines that was mentioned. There is as much similarity between them as there is between any other two nuclear doctrines that are there. But apart from that, I think there are more differences because Israel has not declared itself as a nuclear weapon state, and India has an open nuclear doctrine that is there for discussion, out there for discussion. But apart from that, there isn't much similarity or difference between the two where they can be compared. Because Israel is a false state, so it thinks more on the lines of Pakistan and not more like India in that sense. So yeah, just a short comment.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so time is up, and please, just join me to thank 3, white people, and also extend the, clapping your hands to Adele, please. Thank you, Kanica. Thank you,